we can have Paula's. Gosh, it's really blinding, isn't it, to have that light? Yeah. Okay. Hello, everybody. I think we've got everyone in here, so let's try and get going. Can I encourage you to hold the conversation for a moment? Thanks ever so much. So just as a reminder, I'm Jonathan Cohen from Conciliation Resources, and I'll be hosting the session. But fortunately, that means you won't hear that much from me because we've got some experts to introduce, and hopefully we'll have Julie online in a moment. But maybe just a few opening words from me. When I was invited to come, I was thinking the work that I'm involved in is around peace building, so dealing with violence and conflict, and how do you generate social cohesion to address violent conflict. And I was thinking back about my relationship with technology, and I've been working in this field for over 25 years now. So the start of my journey in peace building was just at the time that the Berlin Wall came down, and you saw these extraordinary transformations in Europe that came about in some ways through what we at the time spoke of as people power, and the antecedents of that in the Solidarity movement in Poland, in the People's Power Revolution in the Philippines, and then the transformation of Europe that resulted from the end of the Cold War, which was really, I think we could say, a time of tremendous optimism. We jump forward to today, and I think we live in a time that is perhaps the pendulum has swung to an age of pessimism in terms of what we see out there in the world in regard to the proliferation of violence and the nature of conflict that we observe on a day-to-day basis. And so into that, it's very difficult mix. We have this question of what can new technological developments do for us? Well, my journey started at a time when in order to send an email, you had to write it on your computer, copy it to a disk, give it to someone who could put it in a central computer and then send the email. And in fact, we were using faxes all the time. I would imagine young people today have never sent a fax. So the pace of change is quite extraordinary. And every day we hear about new opportunities and new framings of what can be done. And for me, what's really exciting about today is partly to get an understanding what big data is, because it's a term that is thrown around all over the place, but do we actually know what it is and what it can do for us? In the conflict field, we talk a lot about early warning and the importance of using data to identify the risks of violent conflict, and how can you warn political actors to take decisions to come up with an early response to violence. So I'm intrigued to see if some of the notions about how we use big data, how we use a more detailed understanding of what information can do for us to be able to predict more effectively the sorts of challenges we've got to respond to. And then I think with the forensic architects, I was lucky enough to see your exhibition at the Tate, and it really is an incredible forensic deconstruction of the way in which violence happens. And so I think what's fascinating about the conversation we'll have here is that we'll be asking questions about accountability. We'll be asking questions about how do you use data to help us hold people to account in situations of violence. And too often we think of technology as something that is a bringer of damage. In context of violence, we're very familiar with the use of drones to drop bombs, the extraordinary expenditure of military in conflict situations. So how do we harness the developments not to support military interventions, not to support the bringing of violence, but actually to reduce violence and to transform situations of violent conflict? The discussion is going to be webcast, so please bear that in mind in what you ask and in the way you frame your questions. We're very lucky to have Julie Hawk on the screen in the middle of the night, I would imagine, in America. So Julie, who's played much more of a role than I have in conceiving what this session is about, is going to share some of her ideas that will help us, when we go into the groups, to think through how we bring innovation to these issues. So Julie, if I could pass on to you to maybe introduce yourself and build up a little bit, and then provide your framing. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to start talking, and if I hear from you that you can't hear me, then I'll readjust then. Perfect. So my name is Julie Hawk. I really regret that I was not able to make it to Istanbul. Mother Nature had some other plans with some big winter storms. So thank you, Jonathan, for stepping in so last minute. And thank you to the organizing team who put up a noble battle against Mother Nature and tried to get me there anyways. But this is working regardless. So I work with Build Up. We're a social enterprise that works with local innovators in complex contexts, integrate technology into their peace-building work. It's an organization that's been around for 4 years, and it also hosts a community of practice around technology and peace-building. Some of you might be familiar with the Build Peace Conference. So I want to begin the framing of our discussions here by painting you a picture. Picture this: some people, young people, aged anywhere from 15 to 30 years old, are crowded around the big 2 tables in a deaf spacious government-sponsored youth house somewhere in Africa. On those tables are flip chart papers and markers, and despite the penetrating heat of summer months, youth are drawing icebergs. If you have participated in any training in peace building or have trained it yourself, you know the iceberg that I'm talking about looks something like this. At the top, they are scribbling what position these conflict parties have, and at the bottom, they're writing what interests and needs the conflict parties might have. This might be a seed that is familiar to you. Now, what use was this conflict resolution training to a smattering of youth in a small North African town? Now, because I was involved in this capacity building project, I know somewhat of the theory of change, if you will, that was behind it. The training was in 2013, and it was a direct response to waves of popular protests, reforms, distrust in institutions, threats of recruitment to extremist causes, economic hardships, and increasing ideological polarization within and across borders. So I won't say that participants here experienced no gains or that this project didn't have value. However, what's clear in hindsight is that we were attempting to respond to very new issues with very old tools and models. And this becomes a reflection of our zone of experiment today. How can we update and innovate our responses to conflict? As a central question to our founding and work at Build Up, we keep asking ourselves this question in many different forms, in different contexts, in different angles, as I'm sure it's a reoccurring question in the work that many of you do if you're here today. One thing is clear, is that in order to understand, predict, prevent, and respond to violence, we need to be able to look beyond the conflicts that we are seeing now. What new shapes are conflicts taking? Who and what are new influences and drivers? Be it rising levels of inequality, climate change, a testing philosophy of the nation state, and what new and existing containers and contexts are we as practitioners working within? At Build Up, we've been looking ahead, we've been trying to look ahead to the kinds of conflicts that we think are going to become more and more prevalent. And the common denominator, what all of these conflicts have in common, and what makes them familiar to the conflicts that we know now, is social cohesion. More specifically, how people are forming, informing, and mobilizing their identities in polarized ways. And this is where we've recently applied the question of today. How can we innovate our responses to conflict? And connected, though not inherent to that question, how can we use technology to do that? Let me reflect some more on that question and the different forms it takes. There's an underlying assumption there, and it's one that we very recently come to question, and it is this: technology is just a tool, and what matters is how we choose to use it. This is a statement that I myself have heard and said hundreds of times. I wonder if you have as well, that technology is just a tool, and what matters is how you choose to use it. This underlying assumption about the neutrality of digital technology has driven our work and ideas around the strategic function that technology can play in peace building, how it can be designed, developed, and utilized. I can now think of several projects. I can list several projects off the top of my head that are utilizing this idea that in the face of technology being used for violence, that they are using it to build peace. But we're increasingly starting to think that technology is actually tooling us. Now, this is an idea and a metaphor arising from my colleague, Elena Puig-Labrori, who has been questioning this deeply. Technology isn't actually neutral, and technology stops being just a tool when it fundamentally alters the human experience. One way to start thinking about this is to consider clocks. I wonder how many times you've checked yours while I've been speaking. Before we had clocks, we had very different experience of time. It was measured according to different processes, to natural processes, to how long something took to do, to the weather, to the seasons, or just how long you wanted to spend on something. But when clocks were introduced, time suddenly began being measured in a different way. And by being measured in a different way, we became conditioned by that tool. Our experience of time changed fundamentally, our experience of work changed fundamentally, our experience of leisure changed fundamentally. And in this way, I'm not sure that clock is just a tool. In a way, it tools us. Likewise, and there is much more to say for each of these, but just to introduce, digital technology is changing our incentives. Digital technology is affecting how we construct and process information and discourse. Digital technology is changing our identities, relationships, and social networks. Digital technologies and the economies and systems of governance that are utilizing them can create or deepen conflict, altering or reinforcing the balance of power in ways that damage efforts towards reconciliation and social cohesion. And this can go either way. What's important is that we know that there has always been a dimension of power to who gets to affect our incentives, our discourses, and our identities. And I think what we want to question here is whether our innovations can re-entrench this power or whether it can reshape it. And these are indicators of things that we think we should be thinking about as peace builders. We should be thinking about how digital technology is tooling us, because we're people who want to build peace in innovative ways and do so using these digital technologies. As a result of that, at Build Up, we're beginning to think about interventions that address this issue. And I'll give you one example. Since last year, and continuing on currently, Build Up is leading a project we call the Commons. This is an initiative that is using semi-automated conversations for countering polarization in the United States. It was started after 2016. The core promise of the Commons is that we believe a majority of the people in the United States are not actively driving polarization. Rather, polarization is happening to us through both the effects of algorithms on social media that create echo chambers and filter bubbles that is increasing the polarization of public discourses, as well as more nefarious actors using what's termed computational propaganda to unethically and or unlawfully use personal data to push on targeted grievances and create illusions of groundswells of support for political actors or for initiatives. In the United States, there are several initiatives that leverage information communication technologies to encourage constructive dialogue and engagement online. However, many of these initiatives reach very few people, and mostly people who are already predisposed to deeply polarized behaviors. So essentially, it's another issue of preaching to the choir in most cases. And that's the gap we're trying to fill by finding people who don't realize that polarization is happening to them. The Commons uses big data analysis to identify people that are engaging in political discussions about the United States on Twitter and Facebook. We analyze the likelihood that they are polarized or polarizing based on their behavior, and we use automation, or a team of bots, of friendly robots, to engage with them. And then we organize a network of trained conversation facilitators that follow up on their contact by bots to have a conversation with them and guide them towards further action and options. While our use of bots is new in the peace-building space, and it offered much in terms of scale and identification, our value was decidedly human. I have a quote here from one of our facilitators, Zach Tilton. He said, "At the end of the day, robots can identify people and forward resources. We're not doing much if the metrics are the amount of invitations extended, because that can be done at critical mass with robots. The value add for facilitators is they can serve as a refreshing exchange in the social media sphere and model an effective way to have disagreements or critical conversations, and make it so the person feels like they've benefited for it." You can read all about our methods and results in depth in a final pilot report we published. If you Google build up the Commons, you'll find it. But in short, our results are promising. We have a sense that the Commons approach and methods could be replicable to other contexts where Facebook and Twitter are shaping public conversations and contributing to growing polarization. The content and messaging would of course need to be very different, but the structure of interventions we think would replicate well. We also set out to start a conversation and a possible ethical model for the role that bots or automated data interventions can play in peace building. And we hope that this can be a catalyst for other conversations and interventions. To the other presenters, I'm so disappointed to not be able to engage with you directly, but I wonder whether anything of what I've explained about how we arrived at this innovation has parallels to the motivations, methods, or ethics that have led you to what you'll be presenting. Perhaps, as a result of these conversations and our various experiments in innovation, we can simply arrive at new metaphors. If I can take you back to our first image, imagine again this training in the dusty concrete room. Imagine if youth, instead of drawing icebergs, were drawing sand dunes. There is, after all, nothing frozen about the region we were in or the conflicts that many of you in the room are engaging with. And much like an iceberg, there is literally and figuratively much beneath the surface of a wind-swept dune. However, the metaphor extends even further. Sand dunes or conflicts are connected and dynamic environments, moving all the time, gathering periodically and slowly to form huge dunes and shifting back to equilibrium to form fertile flats. They represent complexity as things that maintain form over time yet have no rigidity.